But we're lucky that today we have some of the brightest minds with us today for a panel on economic growth, how Africa can achieve macroeconomic stability. So I'm excited to introduce and invite to the stage our moderator, Peace Uwase. Peace is a student in public administration at the Harvard Kennedy School. And prior to joining HKS, she served as the executive director of financial stability at the Rwandan Central Bank, where she oversaw the supervision and regulation of banks, microfinance institutions, the insurance and pension sectors, as well as payments. So I'm excited to invite you to the stage. Please join me in welcoming Peace.
Good morning. Thank you everybody for joining us for this ADC, and particularly for this conversation on the economy, how to revive the African continent's economy. To help us go through this conversation, we're joined with amazing panelists. Help me welcome Professor Reinhart, Carmen, who is, I'm not going to go into the details probably of their bio. They've been shared in the brochures that have been shared, that have been printed. But Professor Carmen is known for her work on financial crisis. And I think this is such a topic of discussion as we start this conversation. Professor Carmen, please join us on the stage. We're also joined with, by Professor Ricardo Hausmann, who is the founder of the Harvard Growth Lab and does extensive work on international development. We'll be looking forward to also hearing his thoughts on how to turn around the economies on the continent. Professor Hausmann, please join us. We're also honored to receive Ambassador Gatete. Ambassador Gatete is Rwanda's permanent representative to the UN. Prior to that, he was a governor of the Central Bank of Rwanda. He has been the Minister of Finance, and he's also been a Minister of Infrastructure. So very practical experience from the continent. So also looking forward to hearing your thoughts, Ambassador Gatete. Please do join us. Are we good? I think we're good. Are they mic'd up? Thank you. So welcome once again to this conversation on economic growth and how the continent can reestablish macroeconomic stability. Why does this conversation matter? It's about people. We know that today more than 50% of the world's population that lives in extreme poverty is in Africa. But we also know that at least 30 years ago, 50% of the world's population that lived in poverty was in East Asia. But the continent was able to turn around that statistic in about 30, 40 years through economic growth. So growth is important and crucial for the continent if we're to lift people out of poverty. And to get us started, Professor Reinhart, I've heard you speak repeatedly and I've seen you write about what you call the reversal challenge. If you could talk us through that and what you see as a potential problem.
Indeed. Is this on?
Yes.
It's on. About how long do you want me to, because
she has a reputation.
They know me, so, I can,
5 minutes?
Okay. So, very briefly, I have followed, I've over the course of the years, I've followed the booms and busts, if you will, in emerging markets by region. And the 1980s was a very difficult decade. It was a combination of crashing international commodity prices. Many of the countries in the region are commodity producers. Rising international interest rates, debt crises, with all the consequences that has for growth, poverty reduction, and really economic development. Now, ultimately better times came. Very quickly, you know, the 1990s, first we saw the beginning of the Highly Indebted Poorest Country Initiative, the international community, the HIPC initiative, which wrote off some of the debts, external debts. Then came the China decade in the 2000s with China's double-digit growth meant very strong commodity prices and a lot of new lending into Africa. And now, what we've seen since 2015 is a big turnaround again. That prosperity period, that period when we saw very significant increases in most of the African countries in per capita incomes, we saw poverty reductions, we saw much more tendency to much more stable inflation, low inflation, and that very prosperous period began to falter around 2015. Commodity prices crashed. And then we began to see, you know, countries, particularly, you know, we saw with the oil producers, saw Angola, you know, the beginnings also of debt difficulties. Then came COVID. And then, as we've just heard, Russia's invasion of Ukraine for the many countries that are either oil importers, wheat importers, or both, and that's a long list. In very significant, it was another major shock. So we've had a series of, you know, in the old children's literature, what one would call a series of unfortunate events. And that, I think, will pose real challenges for policymakers. And it's easy for me to sit here and say, you should do this, you should do that. But I think the reality is it's going to be a period of very difficult decisions. Because I mentioned inflation. Well, inflation has certainly turned the corner in many of the countries, and it's turned the corner everywhere, globally. But you know, the situation is particularly serious in a number of countries, and for some of them, it is coupled with debt problems. So, looking ahead, I think many countries, and I will point out that anticipating in the aftermath, or I shouldn't say aftermath, but in the later stages of the COVID pandemic, anticipating this, the G20 put together the common framework for debt treatment, which is meant to help countries that are having debt servicing difficulties, that have sustainable debt, help restructure debts. So far, 4 countries have applied. They're all African countries. Chad was the first, Ethiopia and Zambia, more recently Ghana. So far, we have had 0 restructurings. And so that is a source of concern. It's a concern that, once again, I mentioned it was for no reason, not in vain that I started out talking about the 80s and 90s, because that was a period in which it took a long time for the international community and the debtor countries to reach an agreement that allowed things to work out, meaning debt reduction. In the meantime, it poses very difficult challenges, and I will conclude by saying the difficult challenges are borrowing from abroad is limited, and you know, right now you have tightening conditions financially globally. Global interest rates are rising. Major central banks are tightening. China, which was a big lender through 2018, now has negative net flows from the region, so net repayment, because it's more leery about making newer loans given the debt difficulties. So that's, you're operating with tight budgets, limited budgets, and I think the two things to conclude, I think that in the past, these challenges were met with fairly across the board and blunt cuts in spending. I think one thing we've learned is one has to be, no spending cut is welcome for a politician or easy for the economy, but there are better and worse ways of adjusting the budgets that do safeguard some elements of investment, both physical investment and human capital investment. That's number one. And number two, be very careful with debt management because this is a tricky period. Credit ratings have had a wave of downgrades, and so managing debt in particularly, very careful with what kind of new debt is taken on, if, avoiding short term, very high interest rates and so on, could really just open you up for even more stress in navigating this very difficult global environment. I know I haven't been uplifting, but what can I tell you?
And as listening to you, Professor Carmen, I was thinking to myself, I'd hate to be a central bank governor right now. I'd hate to be a minister of finance. I would hate to be a minister of infrastructure. Ambassador Gatete, you've been all these things. Hearing what Professor Carmen just shared, where do you see the continent? What would be your recommendations in an environment like this?
Thank you very much. I wish I knew. But from the other side, honestly, the story is different. And you know it when you are in that hot seat. Let me just give you so that you have maybe an idea. We used to have shocks, the energy shocks from 1973, 1979. It used to take decades. The last one, which the big ones we had, was international financial crisis, 2008 and 2009. And then, of course, the Arab Spring, 2011, 2012. This is the first time in the history where we have had the biggest shocks that are back-to-back. COVID-19, before it ended, then you have the war in Ukraine. Both impact are very heavy. During the COVID-19, we had no choice but to save lives. And no production, and you must borrow. Almost all the countries, with no exception. It was tough. Now, when Ukraine came in, it was even worse. Now, I'm the one currently chairing, I'm co-facilitating financing for development at the UN, ECOSOC. And last month, when we came to Washington to meet with the teams at the IMF and World Bank, it was so shocking to see 66 countries are either high indebted or they're in debt distress. 66. And now we have even some countries who are spending money, leaving the country, going outside, which are almost equivalent or more than their recurrent expenditure. So there's no room for investment in development, basically. And this money is living in hard currency. It's leaving their countries in hard currency. Now, for you to understand what that means is that when a country is paying the loan, you are reducing your reserves at the central bank. And once you reduce the reserve at the central bank, you have no room to intervene on the markets. Meaning, if the few commercial banks have the foreign exchange, the price goes up. The value of your currency goes down, and that accelerates inflation. It makes it worse. To the extent that some countries, which I know, I'm not going to name the names, you've read your budget in your local currency, and then you don't implement. The private sector does the implementation. You sign contracts. Then after a while, they come back to you, they say, well, because we are importing from outside, and the exchange rate has gone up, and it's not our fault, it's your fault because you're in charge of economic management, then we have to revise the contract. And then you have the supplementary budget to make sure that you reduce, actually you revise the contracts. So you can imagine that kind of chain of impact. So to talk about development without actually addressing that issue of debt, you are wasting time. And that's why I agree with you. It is so serious that if you don't act now, there is a problem. Where is the problem? She talked about the common framework. We used to have the Paris Club. I participated in 2004 when we had the high indebted initiative in Paris. It was a club, that's why they call it Paris Club, of the rich countries. We go in, we make a presentation, they tell us to go outside and take coffee while they are discussing. So they sat there, then we come back, it's like, someone going for a job interview. You just go there and then wait for the results. We went back and they say, congratulations, you are successful. But now it's no longer the Paris Club. Now we have the India, we have China, we have Turkey, we have the Arab funds, the Kuwait fund, the Saudi fund, Abu Dhabi fund, we have OFID, we have so many others that have come in. And in addition, we have the private lenders because you have issued also the Eurobond and others. So we have other big ones that are there. Now, how do you coordinate all these people together in the same room and take a decision? That's where the problem is, because you are not going to coordinate all of them to agree on the terms on how to restructure. And that's a big problem. Another big problem that has accelerated this, actually, is that the combination, the money that the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and others used to give, they were very good concessional money. 40 years to 42 years, 0.75% interest with 10 years grace period. I wish you could have that for your loan. That would be very important. But for some others, it's 1.5%, it's 2%, 20 years, sometimes 3 to 5 years grace period. Very expensive for a country that has no choice. And the reason why our countries are going to these other outside world to look for money is because our rating is so low. We cannot go to the market and get it cheap. That's why these institutions were put there to help countries like ours on the African continent. And that's where the serious situation comes in now. What do we do? How do we move forward? I don't know if it is encouraging, but I was just explaining the situation the way it is, but maybe there are other ways of how we'll talk more about that later on to see what can be done.
Indeed.
Thanks.
I wish I could take a poll of any policy students in the room that are looking forward to now go and become future ministers, or not future actually, like ministers of finance immediately after graduation. Maybe we'll take a poll later. But interesting painting of the picture. Professor Hausmann, how do we move this forward? How can the continent catch up in the midst of these challenging macroeconomic conditions?
Well, many people in the room are relatively young, so they have to think of their careers for the next 30, 40 years.
Can you hear Professor well?
Is this working? Yeah?
Okay.
Okay. I can guarantee you that in the next 30, 40 years, commodity prices will go up and commodity prices will go down. Financial conditions will tighten, financial conditions will weaken, as they have in the past. The question is, given this variable situation of external conditions, how can you assure that there will be sustained progress going forward? Now, if I look at Africa, and I look at the gaps between, say, Africa and the rich world, or Africa and the US, what do I find? I find that in a bunch of dimensions, gaps have narrowed. Fertility gaps have narrowed. Female labor force participation gaps have narrowed. Education gaps have narrowed. Life expectancy gaps have narrowed. Urbanization gaps have narrowed. Income gaps have not narrowed. They have narrowed in about a third of the countries. They have widened in about 2/3 of the countries. So this is interesting. There's been progress in a lot of things that people would have thought were fundamentals of development, but they're not translating into a catch-up of income growth. And I think that that puts the attention to the central importance of technology adoption, of being able to change what Africa produces, and very importantly, to change what Africa is able to export to each other and to export to the world. Now, in order to export, you need to first produce. And in order to produce, you need to know how to produce. So you have to have a strategy of somehow learning to make the things you don't know how to do well yet. And you need to have a strategy to do that. Now, there are many things that are happening that are positive in that direction, and there are many building blocks on which I think you can accelerate. I think the African continent free trade area is a good conversation point, not just to reduce trade barriers, which I have this memory of being on the triple border between Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Botswana, where I saw the biggest truck line that I've ever seen. It went for tens of kilometers of trucks waiting to cross the border. So I'm keenly aware of enormous difficulties of trade facilitation challenges. But the really key thing is not only to be able to trade more easily the things you're currently trading, but to be able to attract foreign direct investment with an eye of serving the African market. That is, that you are going to have people investing in Rwanda, people investing in Nigeria, people investing in Kenya, people investing elsewhere, not just because they want to supply the local market, but because they want to supply the continent. And the idea of creating a shared big market is going to be an important element to be able to attract export-oriented activities that are going to be looking at exporting to the region. Because in some sense, you might say, Africa is far away, Africa is far away from each other, Africa is far away from the rest of the world, but Africa can be close to each other. So for example, Rwanda is landlocked, etc., but Rwanda is much closer to Uganda, to Burundi, to the DRC, than Europe or Asia or China or anybody else, right? So you are a preferred location to supply other people's needs in the continent. But right now, your export basket is concentrated on the kinds of things that your neighbors also make. And you're not able to make the things that your neighbors need. That's why this is not uniquely African, this is also Latin American, that we have very little internal trade because the kinds of things we know how to do are the kinds of things our neighbors know how to do, and we export them all to the rich world, right? So I think that the African continental free trade area is a good opportunity to create something that will enable companies to come to service the continent. And through that process, you will learn how to make things. And as it always happens, then that knowledge spreads. It might start with a foreign company, but it might spread to local companies. Second, I think Africa has an important diaspora. And that diaspora has an experience in other kinds of firms, in other kinds of companies, in other kinds of technologies. Diasporas can be highly transformative. And I'm really appreciative of the fact that you have a session on diasporas. I think that's an important lever. Number three, I think there's now increasingly trade and services that are connected through the internet. So all the issues of logistics, ruggedness of terrain, landlockedness, and so on become less relevant if what you're doing is serving, providing accounting services or call centers or a lot of activities that a country like Rwanda has tried to actively get into. So I think that's another lever of development. And finally, I'm going to agree with my colleagues here that I think we need a voice to say we cannot afford another lost decade because rich countries cannot pay enough attention to solving the financial problems. And I think it's important that as you coordinate in order to create a free trade area in the continent, that you coordinate to demand a resolution of this financial situation where, if you owe $1, you have a problem, but if you owe $1 billion, your banker has a problem. So I think that political cooperation to put this on the agenda is going to be important.
I feel
Can I say something?
Yes,
on that?
Ambassador.
If you don't mind, and I think Professor Ricardo has really mentioned the regional trade as being one of the key, even in terms of sustaining the development that we are talking about. Let me just give you an example so that you understand. As I said, we're a landlocked country, sometimes double landlocked, because we go to the port of Mombasa through Uganda. So we cross Uganda, we go to Kenya. We had a problem at one point some 10 years ago, and our goods from the port of Mombasa to Kigali was taking 21 days. And we were asking ourselves, what is happening? So our president, who is very innovative, puts two people on the truck. She says, just go to Mombasa and come back and take notes on anything that you meet along the way. So go to the customs. If they ask for money, pay it. If there is a roadblock, pay the money. If there is something else, just let us know. So these people came up with a report. And my president called for a summit of the Northern Corridor with Uganda, with Kenya, with Ethiopia, with South Sudan. So they all went there, and he gave the report back. He says, Uganda, you have this number of roadblocks. What's happening? This is how long you stay on the customs. This is how much they charge. These are the insurance that you pay for each country. This is the way bridges, how many they show for Kenya, they show for Uganda, and the heads of states were surprised. They were innocent, they were surprised. So in that meeting, in that summit, of which I was present, they took important decisions. Number one, for that whole region, you should go without using your passport. You can only use your ID. That was very important. Secondly, they said there should never be any roadblock because there's no crisis here. Why should you stop someone traveling? They all agree on that. And then for the way bridges, which were so many, they were saying you only need one for the country to see if the vehicle is overweight and all that. And for the insurance for your goods, normally they used to pay insurance for Kenya, insurance for Uganda, insurance for Rwanda. They agreed that they should use the commercial insurance so that you only have one. And then for the communication, they removed the roaming charges for the communication, meaning that if you're in Kenya, you're talking as if you're in Rwanda. That was no problem. Then for the clearance, they agreed that they should have the Rwandans, the Ugandans, all being in Mombasa, also doing the clearance, and it became like so seamless. In 1.5 weeks, it moved from taking 21 days from Mombasa to Kigali to 5 days. You can imagine the turnaround, and we saw it directly in the economy. The trade flourished, everybody was a winner. Removing the roaming charges was just like incredible. And that's the time that Rwanda removed the visa requirement that you get at the airport for all the African countries so that you can travel freely. These are simple things, but they mean quite a lot. And that's why the discussion by the former presenter and what you just mentioned and what you mentioned is very, very important. You start from the region, and then from there the movement, because some of them go on foot, others go, they travel by road, and this becomes a quick win before even you go to the continental one, sometimes where there is some infrastructure investment that is required. But there are things that you can do that can allow free movement of people and goods that would help in terms of really addressing the situation. So in the long run, this is really one of the big solutions that can help. The other big solution on a more sustainable basis that's not talked much about is domestic resource mobilization. You cannot always depend on the money that is coming from outside, that comes in hard currency, without developing your own system of domestic resource mobilization. in Rwanda, we have digitized the whole now revenue side. We are now bringing the informal sector to the formal sector, as one of our colleagues was mentioning. We do it in such a way that it is easy, it is cheaper for anyone who is paying taxes, but we can gain from the mass, the numbers, and that would help. And also, I've never seen anywhere a country that has ever developed without a capital market working. There's no country. And that's what we have been trying to build in Rwanda, where you have a stock exchange. We are building the Kigali International Financial Center. We are developing the savings schemes and others to make sure that, because I'm saying it because I had a problem when I was the governor of the central bank. Everything was relying on actually the reserves of the central bank. Then we established our sovereign wealth fund and then other savings schemes to make sure that we can really give a break to the reserves of the central bank. Now, the private sector had no money. Going to commercial banks is very, very expensive, very costly, because the banks depend on deposits of the ordinary people. So there was no long-term resources for the private sector. So there is no way the private sector can participate in the economy. You find that the government is always the dominant factor as far as development is concerned. And this is not sustainable. And that's why it's very important to have a financial system that includes the capital market, but at the same time, having a clear system of domestic resource mobilization that's going to sustain the development.
Yes, Professor Reinhart.
So I think just to continue on the theme of the ambassador and also go back to Ricardo's themes, I highlighted two things at the end. One was, the very dry kind of things that, make you think of paint drying. But, one is debt management and the other one involved difficult fiscal choices. But debt management, people immediately think, oh, she's just talking about external debt. That's not the case, and I think Ambassador pointed this out. One of the chronic, and this is very specific to Africa, I've looked at the issue of domestic arrears. Right, this is domestic arrears from the government to the private sector, from the government to, entrepreneurs, that these are suppliers. So the kind of transformation also that Ricardo was talking about, and the kind of resource mobilization that the ambassador was talking about also really starts with getting your government finances straight. And again, this is increasingly so now has an important domestic dimension. More so than before, because since COVID also, a lot of domestic debt has been issued. And again, domestic debt placement in the banks is directly competing to what little available credit the private sector has for access. So, I know debt management is a very boring thing, but it's actually quite pertinent. And the other thing is very connected to what Ricardo said, the kind of transformation and he mentioned Latin America, and these discussions have been over the course of decades now, if not of centuries, on how to diversify away from, reliance on a couple of primary commodities. But there I want to connect to the issue of crises and what I mentioned earlier, that in bad periods, often what you get is very indiscriminate cutbacks in government spending. And, a co-author of mine and friend Graciela Kaminsky ages ago wrote a paper comparing the growth performance of Asia and Latin America and how they dealt with the debt crisis. And they conclude Latin America does much worse, and Africa is the same in that regard, in that the cuts in budget were disproportionately on investment, very reluctant to cut government wages, and so things, and much more likely to cut also social services. So what do you need for growth? You need human capital, you need, physical capital, and so in bad times it's very important how, not just, yes, it's understandable you your resource, you have fewer resources to work with. So it's extremely important on resource allocation as well as debt management. That's what I wanted to add.
Thank you for that. To turn the wheel a little bit, Professor Hausmann, last December you wrote a very interesting article on green growth opportunities and positioning yourself, as though you were a Minister of Finance from a developing economy. I thought it was a very interesting article. A few months ago, I believe it was in March, the EU enacted the Critical Raw Materials Act that is interestingly looking at, access to raw materials predominantly from Africa and having those processed in Europe. I thought that it was a very interesting contradiction to what you had actually written about in that paper. If you could talk to us a little bit about what you see as the green growth opportunities and how that could enable the continent sort of leapfrog the growth opportunities that exist.
Well, first of all, we must, the world must recognize the fact that Africa has played a minuscule role in creating the problem of global warming, right? Global emissions from the continent are probably less than 3% of world emissions, and cumulative emissions from the industrial times to now are even less than that. So Africa has contributed very little to the problem. It's going to pay dearly for the problem. Now, the way the international community has been thinking about it is that to solve the climate crisis, the world has to reduce its emissions, and they think that because the world has to reduce its emissions, every country has to reduce its emissions, every region has to reduce its emissions, every city has to reduce its emissions, every company has to reduce its emissions, and everybody has to be focused on reducing your own emissions. But there's very little talk about, okay, but what it is that you're going to need to reduce your emissions. And who's going to be making the things that you're going to need to be able to reduce your emissions. So I'd like to reframe the issue, because I think this idea that the world has to reduce its emissions, peace has to reduce its emissions, suffers from the fallacy of composition. For the world to reduce its emissions, many things have to happen. And somebody has to make the things that enable the world to reduce its emissions. So the question that I would ask is, what can my country do to help the world reduce its emissions? Not what my country can do to reduce its own emissions. Africa's emissions are already low, not going to move the needle. But maybe Africa can be an important provider of the means that enable others to reduce its emissions. Now here, the best basket case to illustrate the point is the case of Bolivia. Bolivia is the country with the largest lithium reserves in the world, okay? Now, Bolivia gets invited to this COP27, COP26, COP28 meetings where they're supposed to announce their commitments to reduce their emissions. Now, Bolivia has extracted exactly 0 tons of lithium out of their reserves because they cannot get their act together, right? China has minuscule reserves of lithium, but it's producing at an incredible rate. Australia has about 1/3 of the reserves of Bolivia, and they are the largest global producer. But Bolivia cannot get its act together to produce its lithium, okay? So right now, mining in Africa is maybe in many places kind of the only game in town. But mining in Africa is very small relative to Africa's endowment. Africa has much more mineral reserves than actual mineral production. So I think that there is a Bolivia problem in Africa, okay? That there is much more that can be done with the mineral reserves. And while we all want to move away from our natural resources and to other things, you don't move away from your natural resources. You build on your natural resources and you expand. So it's not about, if I may, next door to Rwanda, there's Uganda. And Uganda found oil a long time ago. But President Museveni he didn't want oil extracted unless somebody built a refinery. As a consequence, he got no refinery and no oil, right? So I think that we have to be a little bit more Australian and less Bolivian. And I think that's going to generate activity, an important source of foreign exchange that will relax constraints in the country, probably an important source of fiscal revenues that will allow to advance in other areas. And then once you have those mineral resources, then we can start negotiating about processing at home. We are seeing right now in Indonesia, they have very large nickel reserves. So they said, look, we have a large domestic market. We are part of ASEAN. This is the right place to build a battery plant. This is the right place to build electric vehicles. This is the right place to build electric motorcycles. We're going to leverage the fact that we have the reserves, but we're also going to leverage the fact that we have a large domestic market and that we have access to other markets. And that, I think, is an interesting strategy of how to play your hand. But I would not accept commitments in terms of greenhouse gas reductions if there are no equivalent commitments to have a role for Africa in participating in the production of the things that the world will need to decarbonize. For example, we are now very actively involved with the government of Namibia. And Namibia has a ton of sun and a ton of wind. Actually, the capital is called Windhoek, which means windy corner, right? And there's the Namibian desert. So it's the ideal place to capture sun and wind. What do you do with that? Well, yeah, maybe you can do some green hydrogen, transform it into green ammonia, and the Europeans are going to be desperate about that. But it's going to be a place with very cheap sources of green energy. So Namibia has to also try to attract, once it builds that, to attract companies to use that cheap green energy so that energy-intensive industries will find it attractive to locate in Namibia. And then the world will stop making things in a gray way in Europe if it can make it in a greener way in Africa. And that's another example of this theme. But I do believe that we have to reframe the discussion. It's not about stopping a coal-fired power plant in Botswana because of climate considerations. No, it's really about if the world wants Africa to play a role in decarbonization, that role has to include not only local reductions, but producing at home the enablers of global reductions.
Thank you. I have enormous respect for our panelists, so I could continue the conversation one-on-one with them for a very long time. So I'd love to bring in the audience right now. If you have any questions for our panelists, there's a hand back there. If we could start with Nat.
Thank you. This is a question to the ambassador, but all the panelists are welcome to answer. And the backdrop is that on the continent, we find that external investors or foreign investors tend to get preference over local investors in terms of tax treaties, protection in terms of investment laws, and it alienates us locals who are on the ground, who have the skill set and the wherewithal to deploy into the industry. So in terms of local resource mobilization, Ambassador, what are you doing in terms of accelerating the syndication of local capital, so that we can at least be confident in deploying sort of into long-term instruments, with a liability profile that obviously matches over time. Because if we don't have that, then we don't have access to 30-year money, which we need as local. So that's part of the question. Yeah, and I guess as Africans, we are skewed towards cash and hot deposits. So what are you actually doing on the ground to ensure that we pivot away from cash and hot deposits? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, if you go, what you're saying, by the way, is correct. I have to agree with you. That's the problem we had at the beginning, but we had to deal with it. Because for investment in the economy, you need the government, you need the private sector. The government has the leeway because, as I mentioned before, you go to borrow outside, you also tax people and you tax business. And that's where you get your money for you to drive that. For the private sector who are investing, and especially for our own commercial, I think Uwase used to be the regulator of the banking system. They know the banking system, they rely mainly on the deposits that are coming in. And that's why even domestic borrowing, as a professor was mentioning here, you have to take into account that you don't crowd out the private sector. Because if you go there as government, then the private sector have very little remaining. And in most cases, this money is short-term because most of the people who are depositing, they want it before the end of the month. So you find that the money is short-term and it is very expensive. We had not created a system where they can get long-term resources. The long-term resources come out of the saving schemes that you put in place. They come out of the stock exchange that you put in place. In our case, when we started, and we were discussing at the Global East African Community, we are saying in as much as we each have a stock exchange, actually it's not enough. Let's link all the stock exchange. And we borrowed money. The World Bank provided the money to link the trading platform of Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda, so that at least you have a common trading platform as a beginning of harmonizing the block, so that in this case, the people in the region can invest in the stock exchange, but at the same time, those from outside would have confidence because they have this time a bigger market. We wanted to make sure that we develop the long-term resources for the private sector to invest. We need the domestic one, we need the regional one, we need the international one. Initially, what you said was happening in Rwanda, but we realized it and we said, no, every investor is the same investor in the country and they need equal treatment. Then we had to put in place a one-stop center, the Rwanda Development Board. It was put there specifically to make sure that every investor, whether you are domestic, whether you are foreign, they support you and you don't need to run out after every ministry or anybody else. You only go to one place, get everything that you need, and then they are the ones to follow up. If you have the problem along the way in terms of implementation, then they will know that the Rwanda Development Board is there to help you out. Because there are so many issues, and the corruption, that's where it emerges when you are dealing with different individuals, sometimes delaying your business. That's why you cannot spend now more than 6 hours without opening your business in Rwanda. 6 hours, you are done. And the rest is now how to follow up. Now, of course, there are many challenges. The only thing that is clear for the foreigners that we put in the central bank law in 2009 was to allow free repatriation of your profits. Because that was a big, big concern. And then, of course, the rest also, it doesn't matter whether you are local or you are international. Those who are making heavy investments, especially in the infrastructure area, we put in an element whereby you are paid in Rwandan francs by the law, but of course, at the dollar equivalent. So meaning that for the big projects, the government shoulders the foreign exchange risk, but they pay you in Rwandan francs of that day based on the central bank rate for that very day. So meaning that actually, at least that issue would be solved. But everything else will have one investment code for everybody, domestic and foreign. So, but for us to reach that level, we first had the problems that you mentioned. And this is something that every country can be able to replicate. Thank you.
Kashal? Okay, well, yes, and then Kashal, you'll give her the microphone. Yes, Professor Reinhart.
I just wanted to add that, I mean, your question also veered very much into the, our domestic investors junior. And I think when I also have made reference to the issue of inflation, that is actually very, very big on inflation is a form of taxation that hits the domestics, but not the external. But also, I think when I talked about arrears, domestic arrears, and this we're talking about private sector suppliers and so on, that does show a difference in prioritization. And so, I mean, what are some of the steps? Well, on the arrears side, it's really about securitization, so that you make it formal, you create a securities market, but on the core issue of creating a longer-term capital market that you can finance yourself, beyond short-term, the private sector can finance itself beyond short-term at high rates. I mean, it really, thinking in the context of where you can't guarantee low inflation, indexation, has played a role. With different degrees of success, but there are a couple of countries in Latin America that indexed to the dollar, and that wasn't particularly successful, but indexation to domestic inflation as a way of making longer maturities is part of the answer. But for that, you also need the government to free up some space for credit to the private sector. And I'll conclude by saying that let's not forget that chronic high inflation disintermediates. I mean, the case of Zimbabwe is an extreme case, but I can list to you many others where intermediation was shot to pieces because of the chronic and high inflation problem.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you very much. Very inspiring and a good presentation. This African problem started from highly debted country. Then from the 2000, it moved on now to COVID, to Ukraine. Whenever there's a high shock in the world, Africa suffered most. What actually is the problem? This African problem have been there for a long time. Africa has a lot of resources, youthful age, brilliant and so many things. What actually is the problem? It has been always a topic being discussion. I think that African leaders move to countries like the US, see a lot of development. Why is it that they are not able to implement? And then always there have been a topical issues, Africa, Africa, Africa. Okay. What I humbly request from the panel, what actually is the problem?
Okay, thank you. Let's give somebody else an opportunity so that we can redeem our time.
Can we take 3 or 4 questions?
Okay, so let's take 1, 2, 3, so that we can manage our time well. 3, 4, okay. Please keep it as short and precise as possible so that we can get to hear from everybody else.
Hello. This is for Professor Hausmann. I just wanted to understand, given the global ESG movement, which seems to have a fairly one-size-fits-all kind of approach, I was quite intrigued by the nuance that you put put forward with respect to the role that Africa can play in the, let's call it the global green transition. Could you maybe just flesh out a little bit more those seeming contradictions between the global ESG movement and the points that you raised?
Thank you. One more.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm wondering, as we're talking about countries that have like very high debt burdens and obviously other challenges, for someone maybe that's going to hopefully be a U.S. policymaker, potentially at a USAID or other agencies, what can U.S. agencies who actually want to figure out how to support countries with high debt burdens do in their policies, say a USAID, Treasury, State Department, that will actually help to solve this problem in the long run? I think some argue for shorter term, debt forgiveness, restructuring, those kinds of things. What can the U.S. do to support IFI reform or to support bilaterally in order to relieve some of these high burdens?
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question regarding debt management. So how to coordinate emerging debt lenders, particularly India, China, and particularly how Africa could leverage the negotiation power in coordinating different debt lenders. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Cashel, if you can take just this question, and there's a lady here, and then we can try to bring it in together. There's a gentleman over there, and then this lady. Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Please keep it as.
Right. So as Africa attempts to replicate the success of other industrialized nations, how can we avoid pitfalls like crony capitalism and human rights exploitation when it comes to workers and employment?
Thank you. Do you have a microphone?
No, but I can amplify. My question is to Professor Hausmann. So just keeping in mind the theme for this conference, which is reimagining Africa's growth on our terms, I think, could you please comment a little on the comment you made about President Museveni? I think him insisting on a refinery was an example of trying to negotiate on his country's terms. And you made the comment that he ended up not getting the oil, neither the oil nor the refinery. If you were in his shoes, how would you negotiate on your terms?
Thank you. Cashel, one last one, and then we can just have the panelists respond to that. My apologies, time. It's the last one, I swear.
Hi, everyone. So you talked about the debt burden of many countries, and I recently read an article that I found interesting, also because of the whole climate crisis we talk about, that said that there is a significant chance to use so-called debt-to-climate swaps in the case of Africa. And I'm just interested in your take on this sort of financial instrument. Is it interesting? Would it be meaningful? And what would be needed to implement it in a significant way? Thank you.
Thank you. So over you to the panelists. You may choose which ones to respond to in whichever order you choose. I think Professor Reinhart, there was a lot of them on, a couple on debt.
Let me just be very quick and selective, but what can be done at the international level? What can the U.S. do? What can we all do to quicken what is a much needed debt negotiation that leads to real debt reduction? I'm going to re-quote the ambassador, put it beautifully. It's really complicated, and it's complicated because the creditors are very diverse. The biggest single creditor is China. And the very tense relationship between the US and China right now further complicates bringing everybody into a room. And let me say, bringing creditors into a room is never easy. Whether they're Chinese creditors, British creditors, American creditors, it doesn't matter. Whether they're bankers or bondholders or official creditors, it doesn't matter, they're creditors. And that means they don't want write-offs. And so it's a real challenge. So what I think is sort of the next thing to work on, I think China being the biggest creditor has, of course, an very important role in this. I think there are amendments out there, and this also connects to the question back there, to bring in also private creditors to the discussions in the common framework. As the ambassador noted, we have, in the case of Ghana, you have bondholders, you have multilaterals. And the last question on the multilaterals, well, look, one of the big things that has been a big push China has had is, well, look, after China, the largest creditors are the multilaterals, the IMF and the World Bank. Why doesn't that debt get haircut as well? And that really, in the end, it's really about how much the other big players, because who are the big shareholders, the stakeholders in the IMF and the World Bank? It's the G7 and the large industrial economies. So that's saying the IMF and the World Bank need to take haircuts is the equivalent of saying the other creditors need to take haircuts. And it's complicated, of course, because nobody wants to take a haircut if they think that their debt forgiveness is going to be used to repay China, which is the impasse that we are in. Last, I promise. One thing where I think we can make some headway is moving to the next stage, which says, okay, let's not start then with face value reductions. At least let's start working down the interest rates, which are at the moment market interest rates and quite high when we do restructuring. So that's would be at least one positive step.
Professor Hausmann?
Sure. Well, many questions and we don't have enough time, so I'm just going to give bullets. I wrote an article in my column in Project Syndicate where I expressed my doubts about the ESG framework. I don't find it terribly useful in terms of directing companies to better investments. And I laid my arguments there. I think it might concentrate companies I mean, the companies in Africa are likely to have trouble meeting ESG standards. So it's going to put capital away from where we would, in the first best, try to move capital into. I think that there was a discussion in the IMF in early 2000s, that's 25 years ago, 23 years ago, about the need for a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. And I think that we will have to end up there, that the world is going to need a way to resolve these crises, and institutionally, the fact that there are so many claimants and so on, and we don't have a mechanism. This is a discussion that back when the country that opposed the creation of the mechanism back when was the US. But I think that under the current scheme, maybe going back to a discussion of it might be important. What would I have done had I been President Museveni? I would have, number one, tried to guarantee as best as possible the property rights I was willing to give investors. Number two, I would have created the biggest possible competition between the different potential investors. And I would use that competition to extract maximum value for my country. But I think that insecure property rights cause investors to discount future cash flows more heavily and consequently be willing to pay less. And companies that are into production are not necessarily into refining. The refining issue could have been a separate company, a separate deal with somebody else. Coupling the two did not add any value. And so I would say that countries need to be as smart as possible in trying to get their national interest maximized in these processes. But I see countries being trapped in unpractical ideological stances that don't help. And the extreme case is Bolivia, but there are many countries that resemble Bolivia in this dimension. I have not thought about that for climate swaps, but I think that, look, there's more sun in the tropics than there is in the North Pole. And there's a lot of biomass that could potentially be produced in Africa, and that biomass can, there's a market that we will need for what they call sustainable aviation fuel. Where is sustainable aviation fuel going to come from? All the airlines are going to need it. They're going to be willing to pay a premium for it, et cetera. Who's going to produce it? You can use biomass to produce not only biofuels, but biochar, and biochar can be a carbon sink. You can use carbon sinks just from reforestation and other things like that. In the world we wish we lived in, there would be a global price for carbon. And countries should be able to document that they have captured carbon and get paid that global price. So I can imagine Africa sinking carbon for a good international price. And that could lead to investments and activities where these things could happen. So in general, my attitude would be, let's try to maximize the fact that the world is trying to decarbonize to create opportunities for development in Africa. But let's not start by asking ourselves the question, how can we constrain African development so that it emits less carbon? And I think that's just the wrong frame. There is a very positive frame on how Africa can help the world decarbonize.
Thank you, Professor. Any last comments? 1 minute.
Yeah, I don't know how much to add, but let me start with Africa. There is nothing wrong with Africa.
Thank you.
It's a perception. And a perception is not something that you can put in numbers. And we have to create the environment. And it is being created now. We are seeing some positive investment. But to have because currently where we stand is not good. Because the ODA, the aid that comes in, is very low. It has actually declined, 61 billion. Foreign direct investment, 83 billion. It's only the remittances that is actually 96 billion. That is also still going up. This is too little. Just to give you an example, the foreign direct investment that came to Africa is 83 billion compared to 84 billion to India alone. So that's how bad it is. And it's for us to be able to create that kind of environment that is going to attract that money. And the Continental Free Trade Area is one of the big incentives and the thing that we are doing to make sure that is being implemented. For debt, urgently, there is something that can be done. They mentioned United States. What can United States do? As you mentioned, it is the largest shareholder in IMF, the largest share in World Bank. It's a big share in African Development Bank. It has a big say in the G20. It has an influence in so many different ways. And with that, it can definitely play a leading role. But secondly, and I think this is very practical, the special drawing rights. We all said, because we are facing a terrible situation, let's cash in on our special drawing rights. US doesn't need their own, doesn't need special drawing rights. That's how it can help these other countries, because they need aid. Some of the vulnerable countries need aid now. They need grants now to make sure that they can survive as we try to address the issue of debt. And then the issue of debt has to be definitely discussed. There is going to be a summit for the reform of the international financial institution architecture in 2025. And in between here, we are now discussing how things are going to go because the institutions that are working for us are no longer fit for the purpose. The reason why countries go to other countries to look for extra resources, which are very expensive, is because the IDA resources, which was supposed to be long-term, which was meant for the countries which are developing, is a small percentage of what is needed. And yet, these international financial institutions have the responsibility to mobilize resources, including sovereign wealth funds and other resources that they can own lend because they have the AAA rating. But there is more importance on keeping their AAA rating than mobilizing extra resources for these rich countries. And you have to design how do we address the issues of developing countries. And that's why they end up going to commercial lending or issuing the Eurobond and also getting money from other places which are very expensive. It's because they are not getting enough. So we have to sit down and address and say, well, in this century now, why should we change? And how should these countries be supported to make sure that they can get more resources mobilized that can help the developing countries? We have the issue also that we have to discuss of currency. Because if you have to pay back in hard currency, you borrow in hard currency, then you must be having a way of making sure that you can generate enough resources to pay in foreign currency. It's a big issue that we think that, and it had worked. Thirdly, there is a problem, just to give you an example of the World Bank or even ADB. Government goes alone to borrow from the mainstream World Bank. And yet there is also the IFC. And IFC goes also to the private sector. They don't talk to each other. And if you are well coordinated, they actually have a private sector window in the World Bank. They also have the IFC. The two don't work together. The MIGA doesn't work together with the government, but they work independent. If there was harmonization, if there was a coordination, then we would gain more. I will give you an example where we had to do one example. We had a project for the water supply in the city of Kigali, 40,000 cubic meters of water. It was costing more than $500. I was the Minister of Finance. I didn't have that money. Sorry, Minister of Infrastructure at that point. So we had to negotiate with the private sector so they can invest in the plant, which was more expensive, and then government to invest in forwarding infrastructure and the reservoirs and the rest of it. So with that one, we had to negotiate with ADB to provide the money, lending, and then the government, we paid half or less than half. And that helped in terms of the private sector coming in. The private sector are having a big problem in terms of getting cheap money, whether external or domestic. And that's where we need to come in and with the risking factors, with also the blended finance and other issues to make sure the private sector can be able to invest. And it's not always the government that has to borrow expensively to be able to invest when the private sector would take that kind of opportunity. But there is what the government can do in terms of de-risking and using the money it has borrowed from outside to make sure that you don't be the one to invest alone, but the private sector can invest if some things can be done. I learned that from the real infrastructure. If I had time, I would give you so many examples of what we tried, but we don't have much time. Thank you so much.
We can meet you over coffee.